Warning, Paranoid Sisters podcast contains disturbing content, explicit language, and opinionated views. Listener discretion is advised.
This podcast talks about the victim's story and does not glorify any crimes. Welcome back to another episode of Paranoid Sisters. I'm Sam.
And I'm Felicia.
And I'm Rachel.
Okay, so today we're diving into a dark and deep disturbing case of Thomas Edward Luther, a man whose violent history and heinous crimes left a trail of terror across multiple states. This story is a heavy one, full of twists and horrors, so buckle up and let's get into it.
Luther's story begins, sadly like many others. He was in an abusive household. He had a troubled childhood, but his path took a much darker turn. Born on June 23, 1957, in Vermont, Luther was the oldest of 5 children. His father worked for a gas company, and his mother was a nurse aide. But behind closed doors, things were far from ordinary. His mother, a petite woman with dark hair, was mentally, physically, and verbally abusive. And it's possible that this might have influenced the type of victims Luther later targeted. Luther was also claimed he was sexually abused by his aunt, adding another layer of trauma to his early life. By the age of 9, Luther had already started drinking and using drugs, and by 12, he was sexually active. His life was spiraling out of control before he even reached his teenage years. That's really sad.
It's super sad. By 14, he had dropped out of school. At 17, tragedy struck when his father died, who was the only person who offered him some kind of protection against his mother's abuse. This loss seemed to push Luther further into a life of crime and violence, and it wasn't long before he started acting on his darker impulses. Now, let's take a journey through the events that shaped this tragic tale. It all began on January 6, 1982, with 2 women who were tragically linked by fate. First, there was 21-year-old Annette K. Schnee. She was hitchhiking near Alma, Colorado, trying to get to work the next day at Holiday Inn, but she never made it. Her body wouldn't be found for months. Then there was 29-year-old Bobby Jo Overholzer. She had just gotten a promotion at work and was out celebrating at a local pub. After the celebration, she hitchhiked home, as was her usual practice. When she didn't make it home by midnight, her husband Jeff went out to look for her. What he found instead was one of her gloves covered in blood in a snowbank near the pub.
The horror continued with 21-year-old Mary Brown, who was at a bus stop in Breckenridge. She was searching for her friend's phone number, but when she couldn't find it, she accepted a ride from a man claiming to be an off-duty taxi driver. That man was Thomas Edward Luther. What followed was a brutal attack that Mary would come to regret for the rest of her life. Luther was quickly arrested for the rape and assault of Mary Brown. He was sentenced to 15 years, but in a shocking turn of events, he was released early in 1993, having served only about 11 years. Once free, Luther didn't waste any time before continuing his violent spree. In March of 1993, 20-year-old Cher Elder was at her boyfriend Byron Power's house when they had an argument. To cool off, she decided to leave with Byron's friend, Thomas Edward Luther. They went to the Central City Casino to visit her friend, a cocktail waitress. That night would be the last time anyone saw Cher alive. So real quick, can we just talk on how many times we investigate and talk through these stories where these repeat offenders get out to recommit over and over again, or short sentences, anything?
Well, I mean,
words?
Prison isn't rehabilitative. You just learn how to commit more crimes in prison, so it's not shocking that people... It's also, once you've been in for a long time, it's hard to readjust to the outside world. So it's often easier to go back to a life of crime than it is to find a job as a felon or be normal.
I also heard that his max sentence was 15 years on this. Mm-hmm. And usually, and I think now today, when you have a max sentence, you can't easily, if you haven't done the time well, then you can, I think, what is it called, Rachel? It's called like a public, I don't know the right word, but it's more like where the jail pretty much can say, no, he's not rehabilitated. We can keep him in for an extra, so long. And so for this to not have happened to where he got like some type of reevaluation is ridiculous. They just said, okay, 15 years, he's done, he's out.
Well, he was like, apparently from what I found, he was like an upstanding inmate. Like he had several jobs in there. He was well liked by the guards. Like he had a good relationship with the prison warden. So like there's a lot of things you can do while you're incarcerated. If you
To
take
help your
college
sentence.
courses, for example, yeah, you can get time knocked off. If you start teaching a college course after you've completed so many things there, then you can get time knocked off. Like there's a lot of little things that you can do to get your sentence slowly reduced. But there's also a minimum and maximum. So I believe for the assault on this woman, like the minimum he had to be in there was 10 years and the maximum was 15. So anywhere kind of within that window, if he was an ideal inmate, then he could be released within that window.
It's ridiculous, though.
Yeah.
I mean, the point of prison is for rehabilitation, but now, does that really happen? No.
No. There's no rehabilitation. Even for people who go in for like lesser crimes and smaller things like theft or whatever. I know a woman who started stealing when she was super young in foster care because her foster parents like never fed her and her foster siblings, and so they started stealing from grocery stores when they were teenagers. She then got caught, went to juvie, learned from a group of girls in there how to hotwire cars, and later when she got out, she got into prostitution and started stealing cars. Then she did like a substantial amount of time in California for that. Now she runs a nonprofit in Harlem that helps people who have recently been released, like jobs and just get reacquainted to the outside world. She's turned her life around, but like I did a couple of interviews with her for something else, and she just talks about how it was so easy to learn how to commit so many more crimes while she was in there. Like she didn't know how to
That's
hotwire
awesome.
cars before that. Yeah.
And the reason why she was in there in the first place was to actually keep herself alive, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which was stealing food, and then she
And
came out
it
to
was the
be.
system's fault that she was in there. Like they put her into a foster home where the foster parents were just using it for money because it's a source of income. And they had like 12 foster kids and they just kept that money. They refused to buy them clothes and food and all of these things. So it's, yeah, very cyclical a lot of times.
We need to do better.
We do.
After Luther's release, he became restless in Colorado and decided to head back to the East Coast, stopping in West Virginia. On August 21st, 1994, he struck again, this time targeting another woman named Bobby Joe. Bobby Joe Jones. Martin Luther, Lord have mercy. All right, I'm going to start this over. Martin Luther King. Okay. After Luther's release, he became restless in Colorado and decided to head back to the East Coast, stopping in West Virginia. On August 21st, 1994, he struck again, this time targeting another woman named Bobby Joe Jones. Luther beat and raped her, but then released her, leaving her alive to describe her attacker to authorities. As the story unravels, let's analyze the key details and evidence that shed light on the events. Initially, Annette's body wasn't found, so no one connected her murder to that of Bobby Joe Oberholzer. There was a random orange booty in a blue backpack that didn't belong to her. When Annette's body was eventually discovered, she was wearing the other booty. And if you guys don't know what a booty is, it's a sock. It's just a small sock. And her family identified the blue backpack as hers. Both women had been sexually assaulted, redressed, and then shot. Annette was shot in the back and Bobby Joe in the chest. Both bodies were found near Alma, Colorado, tying their tragic ends together. So there's actually, if you guys are a little confused, there is two Bobby Joes because, it's the 1960s. I guess there's probably, as there are now, Sam's and Ashley's. The Bobby Joes were like as common as those today. So if you don't know, so there's two Bobby Joes, Bobby Joe Oberholzer and Bobby Joe Jones.
And funny enough, one of the women who testified in this case was a friend of Bobby Joe Oberholzer's, was also named Bobby Joe. She gave multiple statements. Yeah. In Mary Brown's case, Luther had made a mistake that would cost him over a decade of his freedom. Despite being raped and brutally beaten with a claw hammer, Mary fought back and managed to escape, making it to a nearby house for help. She was able to describe Luther, leading to his arrest. When officers found him, he was covered in blood, as was his truck that he was in. Mary's testimony in court was crucial in putting Luther behind bars, at least temporarily. During his time in prison, Luther developed a relationship with a nurse named Deborah Snyder, who left her husband for him. Crazy. She even picked him up when he was released. Snyder later became a key informant, keeping law enforcement aware of Luther's movements as his behavior grew increasingly erratic. She eventually suspected he might have been involved in Cher Elder's disappearance, and her suspicions were later confirmed. Despite multiple people knowing where Cher's body was buried, it wasn't recovered for 2 years. Byron Powers eventually testified against Luther in court, revealing that Luther had threatened his entire family and even cut a ring from Cher's finger to frame Byron if he talked to authorities. Another man, Dennis Healy, testified that he kept watch while Luther buried Cher's body.
Wow. There's just a lot going on. So let's talk about Deborah Snyder. So do we think that she really was in love with Mr. Luther? Or do we think that she was in it to be an informant? Like, where does one draw that line?
No, I think that, she made statements saying she really loved him, and she wasn't an informant initially. So what happened? He got really sick. I believe it was in 1990, and he had to stay in the hospital in the prison for like a month and a half. He had some kind of infection or something like that. I forget what it was. But he was in there for like a month and a half. So that's how their relationship started. She was taking care of him daily, like tending to everything. She was like his personal nurse. And a lot of times, I didn't read this anywhere, but a lot of times these serial killers are very like charming and cunning and can manipulate people in a lot of ways. So they, even after he went back into his regular cell, into the regular prison, they were writing letters back and forth. And she claimed to really, really love him. And she wasn't an informant initially. When he got released, he was staying with her. They had a relationship. It wasn't until he started acting very erratic, she contacted authorities herself and was like, all right, I think like something is wrong. And he had also like, in some of the letters that he had written to her, he had said like things along the lines of like, I don't know why I have these feelings sometimes, like maybe I am a terrible person. So there were like little hints along the way that he was not right in the head, basically.
Okay, so there's like an evolution of a lot of different things going on with their relationship, pretty much. Luther's violent spree didn't stop there. After Cher's disappearance, another woman, Heather Smith, was attacked. Heather had posted an ad in the local paper selling her car, and Luther responded. During the viewing, he struck her 5 times in the base of her neck, nearly paralyzing her. Miraculously, Heather survived and provided a description of her attacker. With his face plastered all over the news as a person of interest, Luther fled to West Virginia, where he would go on to attack Bobby Joe Jones. So we're kind of going back and forth. But when police linked him to the other Colorado crimes, Luther was already incarcerated in West Virginia. He received a 17-year sentence for the attack on Bobby Joe Jones, an additional 48 years for the attack on Heather Smith, and life without parole for Cher Elder's murder once her body was found. I don't know if I read something into this case, but Heather, when she placed her ad and the guy was going to come out to look at the car, I guess she felt like really like the heebie-jeebies about their conversation. So she told her neighbor to basically keep an eye out for her. And her neighbor was actually the one. So when he hit her over the head and, ended up stabbing her, she was screaming out for her neighbor's name. So she screamed her name and the neighbor came out, which ultimately stopped him from killing her, which again, she almost died, but she just, trust your gut, I guess, that kind of going there.
As we dig deeper, one theory is that Luther's victim type stemmed from his relationship with his mother. While this has been proven in some cases, it's not a rule. Others believe his choice of victims was more about accessibility and opportunity. echoing the classic criminal formula of means, motive, and opportunity. There's even speculation that Luther didn't commit the crimes of Bobby Joe Oberholzer and Annette K. Schnee. Some argue that these victims didn't fit his typical profile, and law enforcement has suggested the killer might have been someone more familiar with the area around Alma. Just a note, Bobby Joe and Annette K had long blonde hair, and all of his other victims had like shorter, darker hair.
And actually, too, so as we started looking into this, as far as like Annette K. Schnee and Bobby Joe Oberholzer, on the CBI, which is Colorado Bureau of Investigation. So on their cold case unit, looking these two up, it is actually solved now. So they solved this in 2021, I believe. I think it was 2021 or 2022. So they did find their murderer, and it was not Thomas Edward Luther, which doesn't make him any less of a monster, but regardless, we do plan to do an episode on these two women as well and kind of tell their story. So with all of that, it's a chilling reminder of how unchecked trauma and early life abuse can sometimes lead to monstrous outcomes. Luther's case is a stark example of how evil can fester in the most unexpected places.
So, thank you for listening to today's episode of the Paranoid Sisters podcast. If you find this case just as gripping as we did, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and tell your friends because we love a good tribe. We'll be back next week for another deep dive into the dark side of human nature.
And remember, stay safe, stay paranoid, and most importantly, what the fuck is wrong with
people? Seriously.